This is the World Workplace Europe podcast.
Okay, everyone, thanks very much for being here. We are live at World Workplace Europe in Rotterdam. I'm joined by three amazing guests, and we're going to be talking about diversity in the workplace. So it'd be great if you guys could introduce yourselves first. I should probably introduce myself and say that my name is Matt Tucker. I'm the Director of Research for IFMA, and I'm going to be hosting this podcast. I'll come to you first, Elisabeth, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Elisabeth Nelson. I'm a researcher, a writer, and I worked with the Smart Building Collective. My PhD is in biomedical engineering, but I focus on self-care and proactive healthcare in the workplace through smart buildings, wearable technologies, insidables, all that fun stuff. I started my journey because I burned out really hard in the US. I fell asleep during a bikini wax at a job I loved at a very Google-esque space and thought maybe there's something here that I should explore. So that's what I've been doing the last 15 years or so through a bunch of different workplaces in Europe and finding out what Europeans, what works and what doesn't over here.
Fantastic. We won't get into the bikini wax, but I am interested to hear more about your journey as we go through this. So thank you very much for that. Sophie.
Yeah, very nice to be here. Thank you. My name is Sophie Schuller. I'm also a PhD student. I study at the Technical University of Eindhoven, where I research the impact of workplace design on neurophysiological stress. My background is in neuroscience and psychology. Alongside that, I am also an urban advisor. I work for Cushman & Wakefield, and over the last 20 years have advised a number of organizations on the implication of workplace design, real estate strategy, and more inclusive city and the social value creation that can come from real estate activities.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And Chiara.
Thanks for having me here. I'm Chiara Tagliaro. I am a researcher at Politecnico di Milano. I finished my PhD a few years ago. It was about key performance indicators to measure workplace performance from different points of view and involving different stakeholders. Now I'm focusing more on inclusion and diversity more recently, and how different workplaces and this more like dispersed workplace that we're experiencing nowadays is impacting the quality of work and the performance of people. Going back to how Elisabeth introduced, explained her path, how she took this direction. I remember right after graduation, I graduated in architecture. I was employed as an intern in some public offices, in the Lombardy region offices, in this brand new building that was just inaugurated with, awarded with plenty of, stamps, like Best Tall Building Award and things like that. And then after 6 months working there, I realized that it was not good for anyone, basically. So it was dark, it was noisy, the people couldn't find any place where to have a nice break with the colleagues, talking not about work, but about maybe a more informal conversation and things like that. And so I thought, okay, maybe we can improve this. And so I went back to the university and started my PhD.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I can tell this is going to be a good conversation with you guys. That's amazing introductions. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to kick off with the first question. I'm going to ask you, I'll maybe start with you, Elisabeth. What does it mean to be normal in the workplace?
I think we're much more interesting than that. I think all of us have unique tendencies. We have our best ways to work. Unfortunately, I think normal is this easy idea that we have. I'm getting from Chiara, I'm talking like an Italian now. But I think that normal is this idea that a big general group of us work in the way that is very difficult for actually about 90% of us. So when I started my research with Booking.com, I ended up working on what I called at the time introverted spaces, which then became a place that was very good for the neurodiverse, people who were going through things, people who had jobs that had sensitive information, and guess who also loved them? Extroverts, right? So it's this idea of uniqueness, and I think I'm going to pass to Sophie because she's a good finisher of my beginnings. But I think that this curiosity to find out how we work best and who we actually are, as opposed to pushing ourselves through this cookie cutter, there's so much potential here. And as a researcher and a general impatient person, I'm so ready for that. Yeah. Like I'm really, really fucking ready. Okay, so.
Yeah. I mean, coming at it from a biological or a neuroscience perspective, we are actually, from a genetic perspective, much more similar than we want to give ourselves credit for. We are more than 99% similar to every single other human being on the planet. But in that less than 1% variation, there of course exists an enormous amount of variation. And when we talk about neurodivergence, for example, as we will do later on in our closing keynote, we'll talk about the biological basis of neurodivergence, which is that all human experience exists over a normally distributed continuum. That sounds very hefty, but there is this normal distribution of human experience, and people at the either end of the extreme, on whatever scale or parametric you're measuring, whether it's divergence, anxiety, personality traits, socioeconomic income, they will be, if you like, the ones with the diagnosis, or they will be the ones that have categorical sensitivities that can tell you a lot about how everyone else is really feeling. But of course, that's not static. There are a lot of people that exist just before that line, for example, who also share some of those experiences. So, as you say, Elisabeth, when you're really working with people in the margins, when you're really tuning into the sensitivities that they can bring, it's not just to impact and support those people, but also to use their strengths to support everyone else within that continuum too.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all what they said before. It's much more challenging, of course, to look at people that are not considered the normal or that are not the majority, but actually while addressing these needs, probably we all consider already include the needs of the majority. So this is pretty curious. I don't know, I think we are also in a time when the workforce is becoming more and more diverse than before. So our idea of normal is ill-founded, I think, because before it used to be much more standardized. So we had indeed many males, certain age, and things like that. Nowadays, instead, we have a workforce that is much more diversified in terms of generations. We work much longer than we used to do. We are including different, many more women. Unfortunately, not in Italy. I was listening to a very sad statistic the other day that said that only 50% of Italian women work, apparently. So that is, bad news for us. But, so these are two of the first, let's say, diversity characteristics that we can consider that, of course, have a big impact on everyday life and how we design and manage our workspaces. Let's just think of chairs, for instance. Most of the ergonomic chairs, so to say, are designed for men. And indeed, when women, myself, sit on those chairs, they don't respond to our commands. They don't bend as they are supposed to, and things like that. So in the end, they don't accommodate us. So that's, perhaps addressing these extremes, we can actually include the whole spectrum.
Just before we move on, I just wanted to bring the conversation into the ways in which we're working now in terms of a hybrid world, in terms of remote working. I published an academic paper recently on the individual complexities that people have when they're working from home, and we took data from the first COVID pandemic, and it's fascinating because there's so many individual unique needs. You have some people who just have a strong fear that they don't have a printer around because they're at home, right? And they need to print their documents. And then you've got the other extreme where people are like, my organization is watching me and I feel so stressed because I need to be online. What do you think about these sort of individual complexities or uniqueness of people that you're talking about in terms of this current new way of working? Or is it just the way we're working now? Should we even be saying hybrid? It's just working, right? But it's a different way than we experienced before COVID. How does this play out?
Yeah, I think there's some amazing examples, and one thing that Sophie and I are going to talk about in our talk as well is what we saw during the COVID pandemic is actually the number of premature births went down significantly. And one of the things that they attributed to is maybe, like Chiara was saying, women got to sit in positions that were much more comfortable. They got to have more rest. They could schedule a nap, and they could live in a way that was much more natural and healthy for growing a fetus. So that's an extreme situation, right? We're talking about the birth of a child. But indeed, I think it very much is the way that we're working now. It was a big adjustment for me today to travel to somewhere, we're used to, we can have an amazing conversation online. But I think the uniqueness of this and kind of letting ourselves go also opens up this huge opportunity, because a lot of times when we talk about diversity, we say, this wasn't made for a woman. It wasn't. A bunch of men made it, and through their best intentions, if I made a chair, it would be too low for you, it would be too soft for you, and it would probably have too bendy for you, right? And that's even with my best intention, I can't make a chair for you as well as a man can probably make a chair for you. But when we get into the nitty-gritty of exploring and saying, having the right people representing those same people and having diversity, it's much more interesting, because we have this going on. And beyond that, instead of saying, there's the there's the normal, and then there's the neurodiverse, and we're going to give them some niceties, and then we're going to continue with the big, ginormous group of normal people, right?
Yeah.
It's so much better if we all get a little bit more excited about finding ourselves in this workplace, because the workplace does not suit the vast majority of us.
Yeah.
And we do need some changes, and I think, Sophie wants to talk.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, but I also feel compelled to add some critical analysis, which is that we have to also question, to what degree are organizations responsible for our individual preferences? Organizations are geared up to manage groups of people, and I think what we're talking about is getting to that level of granularity that's maybe one, if not 2 or 3 stages deeper than what we already have. Right now, we have employee, and we get the same size keyboard, chair, everything, regardless of your body type or your gender or your nationality or whatever it is, whatever type of demographic factor impacts you. What we're talking about is trying to break groups down a little bit further so that we can start to speak to differences that exist across different continuums, but for smaller subsets of people, so that the space becomes, or that you can find your space within a workspace that represents more of who you are and what you need. I think when we start talking about hybrid, it very quickly becomes very individual. I work from home because it suits my needs, and I do work from home because it suits my needs. But what we're also seeing is this proliferation of research that also shows my not being in the office impacts other people in very demonstrative ways. So I'm always kind of quick to bring it back to, yes, we want to provide a space for as many people that works as possible. No, we cannot do that on a highly individualized basis. That is unfair to the group. And one of my biggest concerns is, how do we start to, as part of hybrid and as part of the new way of working, because it is the new way of working, how do we start to weave the thread of the value of being in a community and the responsibility of being in a community?
It's interesting what you said about organizations dealing with groups and not so much individuals. So here's a scenario for you. How do you feel about organizations who say, which is very common, we have a 50% hybrid working policy? 50% in the office. It's clear, it says in black and white, 50%, not 40, not 60, 50%. It's very generic. Or 3 days on, 2 days at home. What do we think about these more generic policies? Because they're everywhere. You see them everywhere.
Yeah, that's true. I've read of an experiment that was done before COVID on a specific workplace, because it was the case of a call center in China. And so the experiment consisted on dividing the workforce into groups. One would stay at home and one would keep working from the office as normal, as usual. And then they noticed that the productivity of people working from home increased a little bit. Of course, this depends in the specific case of a call center on the fact that there was not as much disturbance as in the office, and they could maybe focus more on the tasks. And then they decided to end the experiment, but they still allowed the employees to choose if they preferred to keep working from home or to come back to the office. half of the group that was working from home decided to go back to the office, and the other half stayed home, and their productivity increased even more. And that was because choice entered into play. So basically, it's true that the community dimension and group dimension needs to be considered, of course, but probably the individual choice is also one point that can actually boost our well-being and productivity as a group overall. So there are different elements to count and put into the study of this very complex issue.
You, Elisabeth and Chiara, you both mentioned some gender characteristics and how perhaps they're not, whether it's workplace design or ways of working, are perhaps not necessarily suited to one gender or the other. It's International Women's Day tomorrow. We at IFMA have published a report today on women in FM. It's a really interesting study, and it's produced some thought-provoking actions that need to take place. One of them being about more flexibility for organisations and actually embedding a culture of flexibility, whether that be working part-time, working from home, whatever it might be. I know, Chiara, you've done some really interesting research recently on gender diversity. Do you want to give us a little bit more of an insight to that?
Yeah, sure. Basically, we conducted a literature review just to understand the extent to which we have already addressed this issue. And what we figured out is that this is mostly something that is dealt with in the human resource management literature, and instead there's not much attention on the facility management design literature. And the two things tend to remain pretty separate. And that's what I also noticed actually these days. There's a lot of data and information that we have that belong to the two fields, let's say, but it's never cross-checked. Or very seldom. So that's, I think, the main point of our research. What came out is it's important to conduct intersectional studies, so including different diversity characteristics, not only gender, so include the different aspects, and also try to cross-check what is more in the human resource interest and what is instead really reflecting how people use space and how space is supporting people's activities. Probably if we start merging these two types of data sets, we can obtain much more insights.
Fantastic.
And I think we also have to just admit we don't have as much data on women. We don't have decades of data on women. One of the best talks I saw on diversity, which is going to be part of Chiara's event coming up, was someone talking about when they started using female crash test dummies. And Matt, I'm just going to give you a little quiz. Do you know when they started using female and child crash test dummies?
I feel like I should know, but I don't.
2013.
Okay.
Is when they started. And there's speculation on why this was done. Obviously, it's a lot easier to make a car that doesn't kill men than it is to make a car that doesn't kill women. So the standards, and of course it's also a middle-sized man, so a smaller man or a larger man doesn't fit this criteria, right? So one of the things we just have to admit is we don't have the data that's informing all of the AI that's coming out. We're also talking about that in our upcoming keynote, but we need to gather more data on women and then apply it as much as we can, because we don't have it. And that also applies to other groups, whether it be social, economic, cultural, anything. We just don't have as much data on them.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think about the IFMA report, which is being released today. And, this is a really in-depth report, but there's very little else to go off as a benchmark to that exists. And also, I think the statistic in the report is there is only 20% of women in the FM industry.
Well,
so
I'd like to challenge
that. Sample size is go for it. Yeah, please do.
I'd like to challenge that. And maybe I haven't read the report, but I'm really excited too. Because whenever we talk about industries, FM industry, real estate industry, we talk about the people that work for the professional organization. So the leaders or the managers of the cleaning staff. What we don't ever really talk about, even in the context of workplace design, is the service staff, the receptionists, the cleaners, the the mechanical and electrical engineers. And traditionally, of course, cleaning and certainly catering has been a predominantly female group. And there are now some interesting dynamics that are going on within that section of the workforce, with a much higher prevalence of migrant men coming into that profession. But I think the FM profession as a whole is disproportionately focused on women if you consider the entire supply chain. And I don't have the facts, so I'm going to go and fact check myself. But
yeah, I would have to check where that 20% has come from as well, and what the boundary is around it. But I could bore you to tears about the fact that there is no data in terms of an FM population that exists globally. So it's really difficult to say there are this amount of people and I can draw a line all the way aroround it, because it is 100%. So diverse, which makes it such a cool profession, right? Because it's so diverse and it's so it's multifaceted in terms of the service scope as well. Okay, we won't debate that in this podcast. That's another podcast, right? You guys have the privilege of, we have the privilege as the audience to have you doing the closing keynote today. Do you want to just give us a little insight or a little sneak peek of what we can expect to see and hear in this keynote?
You do the meat and the potatoes. I'm going to do the chocolate sundae.
Okay.
She is the chocolate sundae, the one to wait for.
Are they not on the cards here? We're just going with meat and potato and what was it, chocolate sundae?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's switch on. Should we start with?
So our presentation is exploring the question, who are buildings for? Yeah. And it seems like a bit of a glib question. As I say, I come from a real estate background, but I spend a lot of time also with architects. I've spent most of my profession advising people on the economic value of buildings, and most of my educational profession of understanding other values of buildings, like the social value or the health implication of buildings. So really, our presentation today is a whistle-stop tour through the combination of 20 years of our professional and academic experience that starts to really challenge who are buildings for, and in which ways can we view them and should we consider them. And of course, at the heart of this is this idea about, and I hate to use this word, human-centered. And I hate to use that word. I put it right up there with livable cities, because if cities aren't livable, then what are we doing? Or if we're not designing for humans, then who are we designing for? So it sounds kind of glib, but what we're trying to do is to inform and raise awareness and give the audience an alternative lens to view buildings and the way in which they might not accommodate any of us, actually. Yeah. But it's not all doom and gloom. I mean.
No, so we do paint a real picture of what's going on. We are not kind of shining over this wonderful AI that it's going to fix everything, and we look at it with a real lens. We also look at the real ripple effect of some of the decisions we are making and more importantly, can make in the future, and even some decisions that we've made which maybe felt like a step forward when we made them, but are actually a bit of a step backward. We talked about depending on the age of the audience, powder rooms in women's bathrooms. And if you're old enough to know, it's this kind of very comfortable place by the toilets that had couches and mirrors, and it was this place where women were supposed to be putting on their makeup. But of course, they weren't putting on their makeup, they were talking. And what were they talking about? Men, because that's what we do, because men are different than women, as we're learning, and not just strange behaving women. They're actually, I'm learning this, raising men myself. But so there was this kind of safe space to talk about things that they were going through in their life. And now what we're seeing in workplaces is we're trying to get these, for instance, breastfeeding places, which are usually, in my experience, where they store the copy paper and have people coming in to interrupt, and it's a very awkward space. If we had powder rooms, what we could possibly have are women who are all on the same schedule of pumping 3 hours apart, coming in and talking to each other in a safe space about all of the crazy and awkward things that they're thinking, maybe smothering their husband with a pillow while he sleeps through a baby crying. Who can sleep through a baby crying? And having the, most importantly, you're not crazy conversation. And that is something that is super important in our spaces, where men can get together and have talks, where women, where older individuals, where people who are in very individualistic groups can say, am I nuts? and other people can say, at least not entirely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's so powerful in this. And I think the potential of all of this that's going on is better representation through data, getting more data on women, applying it through space, doing some really fucking cool shit, and having people feel like they're not nuts.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think we're about at the end of the podcast now. I want to really thank you all three of you for being here today and giving up your time. Fascinating subject area, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your keynote later on. So thanks very much, guys.
Yeah, thank you. And well done with the report. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This is the World Workplace Europe podcast.